really where I want to begin, and I'm not going to mention names or other things outside of my kids. I do have four lovely boys that live with me every day of the week, and as we kind of try to bridge the gap of what we're going to talk about today, I want to, as a parent, there's this thing about what we love to call chores. You know what I'm talking about, right? This concept of teaching your kids the responsibility of taking care of things of which you need to take care of, right? Like doing the dishes and taking out the trash and cleaning bathrooms, cleaning rooms, vacuuming, all those wonderful things. And the concept of that, I thought I understood what it meant before being a parent, how you train someone to do that. Well, you give them a task, you show them how to do it, and then you go, you got it, go do it. It's not that simple, not at all. In fact, I learned a new phrase through the process of this, which really means, if you dig into it, this is what it means. I hear you, but I really don't care what you're saying right now. This is the best way that I can tell you that I'm not going to do this, okay? And so now it started with my oldest and has reached its way all the way to the youngest. So I call and ask, so you need to take out the trash, and my response I hear, because they're playing a video game or they're watching a television show, I know that you ever hear that before? But I'm not really gonna. I understand what you're saying, Dad, but no. So I, as a parent, going into that conversation and trying to teach my kids the responsibilities they're supposed to take, that's a challenge. I mean, come over to our house, we know you're coming, you're going to see a different world as opposed to if you just showed up on the front door. So from day to day, it looks a little bit different. But that's the challenge of teaching your kids responsibility. That's the challenge of showing them the details of what has to happen in order for things to be done in a clean, healthy, and a responsible way as they go on to be adults. I've seen all spectrums of that in my lifetime, and I know what I would like to see when we go visit someday. So, but all of that being said, the truth is that, if you have a teenager, I've done some teen ministry in the past, you know that at some point you come across this moment where your teenager knows more than you do, right? Have you been there? Anyone been there before? Well, I've been there. I'm there right now. With two of them and maybe the two youngest too. But they always know better than what dad or mom knows. So, and the truth is all that they can really see is the tree in front of them. They can't see the bigger picture of what you're trying to teach them or what you're trying to bring them to the table and try to understand. But they know better because they see the details of the tree. And we probably have forgot some of the details when you dig into it. So, but all of that being said, we're going to look at Mark today. And we're going to look at the Gospel of Mark. And some of you in here, your favorite might be the Gospel of John. I mean, that's a lot of people's favorite is the Gospel of John. Or Luke, because of the history, it flows right into Acts. Or it could be Matthew, because it brings the Old Testament and the New Testament and brings it together. But for me, it's the Gospel of Mark. And the reason why, it's kind of a selfish reason, I love a story. I don't know about you, but I just love a good story. Now, Matthew has his way of doing it. John has his way of doing it. Luke has his way to tell the historical picture of the gospel. But Mark is about telling the story of Jesus Christ, about our Messiah, about the one who came from heaven, was born of a virgin, and then walked through this ministry that died on a cross and then rose from the grave. And that, to me, seems like a pretty difficult task. But on top of that, you think just telling the story alone is good enough. But Mark does some things within his narrative that just astounds me. He pulls in a parenthetical emphasis, and I know those are big words, but basically what he does is he takes two similar stories, like we're going to talk about the blind man from Bethsaida and then Bartimaeus on the other end of that story. And what he's doing in a sense is he's taking these stories and saying, hey, pay attention. What I'm saying right now is incredibly important. Now, did you get that? Two stories put together. Pay attention to what's in the middle of these. This happens about 6 to 8 times within the Gospel of Mark. I didn't go back and add up. So it happens a lot. But the other cool thing about Mark is that every time you get the base story, there's always something underneath that story. And when you dig into the underneath side of that story, there's always something else underneath that story. And what my challenge today is to to try to tell this story the best way that I can, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about this concept of the fact that, sometimes in life we are just like our teenage kids. We oftentimes only see the trees in front of us and don't see the bigger picture of the forest. And that really is what the concept of this is, because right here where the disciples are, they're just like teenagers right now. They just don't quite get it. So let me go backwards a little bit and kind of build up to where we're at, because that's incredibly important. So Mark chapter 1, we do not begin with the birth of Christ. Instead, we begin with the ministry of Christ, at his baptism from John the Baptist. And we go right in to him telling everyone, what I'm here to do is to bring in the kingdom of God, to talk about God's reign, which is near. That's why he's here. And so he preaches and he teaches and he goes out and prays by himself and he's healing people. And then he comes to a controversy. So he shows three or four different things. I won't be able to name three. But he shows that he has power over the earth. He calms the storm. He's able to do different things. He has power over sickness and blindness and leprosy. He has power over those things. And then finally, he has power over sin. He shows all those three things, and that final thing becomes a pretty specific and difficult situation for Pharisees and Sadducees and teachers of the law. In fact, at some point, when they lower the man through the roof, if I could talk, if I can remember what I want to say, as they lower him through, and he's here to heal this lame man who can't walk, and it's so crowded they had to pull him down through the roof. He instead heals him of his sin and his lameness. And he gets up and he walks out. And it isn't, what makes a good story? It isn't, the big moments. It's the conflict, right? So people are upset. You ever said something that just absolutely upset somebody who you love and you care about, or at least someone on the peripheral? Well, Jesus did it all the time. He brought to the table something important. So he says this lambastic statement. Is that a word, lambastic? I think so. I don't know. It is today. You guys get what I'm saying. So, but he says this, and the Pharisees then begin plotting the death of Jesus Christ. And we go through this cycle of him doing miracles and teaching and teaching parables and doing all these things. And we lead up to this moment. And as we're going through that, people are amazed. And they run away, and they come, and then they run away because they don't understand. And then the disciples are there seeing the power of Jesus develop, and they have this lens and they have this perspective of who Jesus is supposed to be. But at the end of the day, their perspective is wrong. It comes down to this climax in Mark chapter 8, which I don't have up for us on the board, but this is Peter's confession of the Christ. And it says, Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. On the way, he asked them, "Who do people say that I am?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." But then Jesus says, "But what do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter steps up and he says, "You are the Christ." Great moment, right? We got it all figured out. We could close the book and we're done. We got it figured out. Well, the problem is the disciples don't have the full context of what they need to hear. In fact, if you look back, I'll challenge you, go back to Mark before this, all the way through the last blind man story, and look what happens every time Jesus heals somebody. He tells them to not go tell others. Seems weird, doesn't it? Why would Jesus say, "Don't go tell anyone about what I just did"? In fact, it's a great genius way. It's kind of like good psychology, right? Tell them not to do it. What do? They go do it. But that's really not the point. He's telling them not to go do it because they don't have the whole picture. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's kind of like, speaking of psychology, you got a bunch of people in a cave and all they see is the cave and they think their world is the cave, but all they got to do is turn around and they see something different, right? And they walk out and it's a brand new world. That's sometimes how we get. All we see is the tree and not the forest for what it is. So all of that, hopefully that's worth our time to get there. But all of that, I'm gonna challenge. I'm gonna do both blind man stories at the same time. Can you do that for me? Awesome. After going through it this morning, this will make more sense for us to do it this way. So the first story is Mark 8, verse 22, the healing, if I can talk, of a blind man at Bethsaida. Verse 22, they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside of the village. When he spit on the man's eyes, and it's got to be a great experience, right? Someone just spitting on your eyes, and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" Verse 24, he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking around." What's he trying to say? I see the silhouettes, but I don't see the details. I don't see the specifics. They just look like people. That's it. So once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes, and his eyes were open. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't go into the village." Or, as the ESV says, do not even enter the village. He's saying, don't go tell others about what's going on. So, that being, let me ask you, do you believe that Jesus has the power to heal this blind man, to do it right the first time? I guess is what I'm getting at. You guys ever, that's another principle I try to teach my teenagers, do it right the first time. So this could be a little bit difficult here, but so there's got to be something bigger going on. If you were to fast forward to the end of the text of what we're going to look at, which is at the end of chapter 10, there's another story, the other piece of the parentheses. Verse 46 of chapter 10. Then they came to Jericho. As Jesus and his disciples, together with a large crowd, were leaving the city, a blind man, Bartimaeus, that is the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stopped and said, "Call him." So they called to the blind man, "Cheer up, on your feet. He's calling you." Throw his cloak aside. He jumped to his feet and came to Jesus. "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asked. The blind man said, "Rabbi," or teacher, "I want to see." So, "Go," said Jesus. "Your faith has healed you." Immediately, Dan, I should have listened. Microphone fell off. So, immediately, he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. Same thing. Did it once this time, right? But Mark specifically says he sees clearly. Right? You think that's by accident? No. Mark is too good at what he's doing. So again, this happens. Mark says, pay attention. What happens in the middle is important. So what's going to happen in the middle? It's real simple. Mark is getting ready to tell you how to see discipleship clearly. What does it mean to follow Jesus Christ? What is this way? Who is this man? What is he really about? When he says he is the Christ, the Messiah, what does that really mean? So pay attention. That's important. So what he does in this, there's a bunch of important stuff in here, and we're going to pass over a bunch of it. But we're going to hit the highlights, okay? Three times in this text, what Jesus is going to do is he's going to predict his death. We're going to refer to these as the passion/resurrection prediction. The very first one's going to be very general. We're going to get more specific and more specific. And what's going to happen is we're going to get a prediction. The disciples are going to misunderstand. And then Jesus is going to teach us something incredibly important. Okay? So here we go. Mark 8, verse 31. He then began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke Jesus. Now, just a second, let's rewind a little bit. Remember, I just said Jesus just told Jesus, "You are the Messiah. You are the Christ." And Peter goes, "I don't think you know what you're saying," which is kind of ironic if you think about it. So we go from this huge climax, we got to figure it out, to the very bottom. Jesus is like, man, I got to start over again. So, if you think about it, though, if you think about from the disciples' perspective, how incredibly earth-shattering would this be when you hear your Messiah has to die in order for him to fulfill what needs to happen? It's got to be earth-shattering. And I completely understand why Peter would do this, but it's still amazing to me that he would do this to Jesus, right? I understand one of the other 12, but not Jesus. In verse 34, then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, if anyone would come after me, so here's the pay attention part, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for a man to gain the whole world yet forfeit his soul? Or what can a man give in exchange for his soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of him when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. Let's just be honest. There's a lot to unpack with this thing, but I got the challenge of trying to summarize this thing in one statement. What does he say? You must put put Jesus before yourself. Isn't that what he's saying? We can't save ourselves. Now, we're going to unpack that a little bit later, but here's something to think about. What is the point of this? I believe Jesus is saying it isn't you to go out and accomplish this task. It's me. You can't go do this. And what does that practically mean for you and your faith and your walk today? Is you can't be Lord of your life. Jesus has to be. And let me just say, as simple as that is to say, it is a hard truth to live. And we'll talk about that more here in a second. So that's the first one, right? You with me? So we got a prediction, we've got a misunderstanding, and then we got a moment of teaching, right? So, well, there's two more. It's like Jesus did this for a sermon later on, 3 points in a sermon. 3 points, a poem, and you got a sermon. That's what they say. But Mark chapter 9, we're going to fast forward a little bit. And then this happens again. So there's some things that happen. We got the transfiguration, which is a big deal. He heals a boy with an evil spirit. And then in verse 30, it says, they left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed in the hands of men. Now that's new. He didn't say that earlier. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. Why were they afraid? Remember Peter? he tried to do it privately, but it didn't work out that way. So they came to Capernaum. When he was in the house, he asked them, what were you arguing about on the road? So instead of talking to Jesus, they went privately. I guess they either let Jesus go way behind or way in front, but they were obviously arguing. But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. Sitting down, Jesus called the 12 and said, if anyone wants to be first, he must be the very last and the servant of all. He took a little child and had him stand among them. Taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever welcomes one of these little children in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me does not welcome me, but the one who sent me. Now, I think this is where we have an issue. I'm going to hit another piece of text that I don't know that we have on the screen. He goes on, and there's a segment about whoever is not against us is for us and causing others to sin. There's a section about divorce. And then verse 13, and what's interesting is that here we hear about children, and we talk about putting others before ourselves. But then he also talks about if someone gets in front of these children or having faith, they might as well have a millstone around their neck and be thrown into the sea. And then we have this passage in verse 13 of Mark chapter 10. It says, people were bringing little children to Jesus to have him touch them, but the disciples rebuked them. When Jesus saw this, he was indignant. He said to them, let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. I tell you the truth, anyone who will not receive the kingdom of God like a little child will never enter it. And he took the children in his arms, put his hands on them, and blessed them. So again, we have prediction, misunderstanding, and teaching. Now, in my opinion, this is the hardest one of the three that we're going to talk about today. Okay? What I lean towards, what Jesus is talking about, if you go back, it's not about being the greatest. Instead, it's about being a servant. It's about being someone less than the other person. And then he points to children. What I think the point of this is that Jesus wants us to be childlike. He wants us to become childlike. And, I already told you about my teenagers at home, right? So let's just be honest. If you were to point to children, there are some things that you don't want to be like. Like, we celebrated leaving diapers. Not sure that's what he's talking about. I'm sure we're not talking about that moment when your teenager, you and face to face, and you're not getting through to them. That's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about a lot of different things, but I do know what he, to some degree, is talking about. He's talking about us not making a mountain out of a molehill. And we'll dig into that in just a second, okay? But I want to finish the story, and then we'll dig into that a little bit more, okay? So we've got 2. So guess what's going to happen again? We're going to have a prediction, a misunderstanding, and then we're going to have a great teaching. So Jesus again predicts his death. Verse 32 of chapter 10. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished. While those who followed were afraid, he again took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to him. We are going up to Jerusalem. It's almost like this is, you didn't get it before. Let me make it a little bit clearer. We're going to go up to Jerusalem, boys. We're going to go. He said, and the Son of Man will be betrayed, and the chief priests and the teachers be betrayed to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. You think, okay, 3 times we ought to get it, right? Peter does later on in the story, right? It takes 3 times he finally gets it, but this time, not so much. Verse 35, then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you, he asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left in your glory. Now, it's amazing to me that these 2 had the gall, the pride, if you will, to actually go to Jesus and ask, do whatever we ask. Now, that just seems pretty lambastic. There's that word again. So, but the truth is, you don't know what you're asking, Jesus said. Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with? They answered, we can. So Jesus said to them, you will drink the cup I drink and be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. Misunderstanding, right? Now the teaching. Well, not quite. When the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who regarded as rulers, let me pause, what were these other 10 disciples upset with? That's the question, that's the big question. Were they upset that they didn't ask? Or are they upset that they should have got it by now? I don't know. I lean more towards the first one. I think they're upset because, dang it, I should have said that. I should have asked that. And they got all over James and John. What are you doing? Because they wanted to be on the right and left. So Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Big stuff there. This one is a little bit, I think it's easy to understand, a little bit harder to live out. So we've got and we're going to go through each of these individually and just try to unpack this a little bit. But the last one is this. Not only does God want us to serve people, right? He wants us to be, now this is a word we don't talk about much anymore today. He wants us to be a slave to others. That's a tough word. That's a big, big challenge. What's he talking about? I think it's this. He's talking about the fact that he wants us not just to serve, but to sacrificially serve. He wants us to be sacrificial servants. That means that when you go and serve other people, you're not expecting something in return. It's the opposite of that. It's instead, you're just going to serve because your Lord and Savior has called and commanded you to do so. That's a whole nother sermon, but get it? So I want to go back. Let's go backwards. Let's talk about the first one. Let's talk about Jesus saves. This is a big one. And I I chose to skip over what I'm about ready to say in the first service. I don't know why. I may get in trouble today after I talk about this. So, you guys have Facebook? You know what that is, right? You learn everything you need to know on Facebook, right? Or at least you know what others' opinions are in a heartbeat. I've got a brother. I got a couple, so you don't know which one it is. So I did not cross my arms. So he had a post today, and first of all, I don't think it's the preacher's position to make a political statement, and I'm not trying to make any type of political statement, okay? But I do have my beliefs and my understanding about what's happening in the world, and I will get to our point, I promise. There were 2 shootings yesterday, right? Tragedy. Every time there is one, same statement comes across my Facebook page. We need to change the gun laws, we need to do this and that and whatever. You know what I'm talking about. You get the same posts that I do unless you've unfriended them or stopped following them and you don't pay attention anymore, or maybe you have that opinion, and that's fine. That's fine. But let me tell you what the real problem is in our nation right now. We don't have a morality anymore. We don't have a basis by which we live across the nation. For most people, it's gone. So when they're hurt, or in fact, the opposite of that, we have bullying and hurting of other people with no concern about what that's going to transition into, because we just don't care as a nation for the other people that are around us. Do you follow me? At the core of Jesus' message, in fact, and I may be stepping out too far here, but I wonder if it doesn't center around this new thing called entitlement. And it isn't just our millennials, it's me, it's all of us, where we feel entitled for the things that we have and the person we are, and then we act out because we don't have any moral regulations to keep us from doing what we're supposed to do. We don't have a Savior across the nation. We used to be a Christian nation, and we could talk about how the church messed up a lot of things in the previous history and the past history, but what we did get right is we had some moral obligations, what we could do and not do, right? If you look across the school system today, I don't know that that's the case. And I know these shootings obviously weren't school shootings, they were other shootings, but so I guess here's my point. The problem, whether you agree with me or not, is I still don't believe it's a gun problem. It's a person problem. It's a society problem, and it's not as simple as taking something away. We have to get back to the core of who we are as Christian followers. Now, I say all that, and I know that's pretty darn political, and I apologize, but it is close to my heart today, and we definitely want to pray, and we will here in a little while, for those families who are going through the struggle that they're going through. But how we fix that is we allow God to be Lord of our lives. You know, it's a decision that probably many of us in this room have made. We've put on Christ through baptism. We've been buried in the baptismal grave and rise anew as a creature. But even still today, you make a decision about who's in charge. Is it you or is it Christ? When you make decisions for your life and the way that you treat people and how you choose to react, is it you making that decision or is it Christ's teachings helping you make that decision? There is a difference, and it is dramatically different. The truth is, at the core of this, obviously the message is that we cannot save ourselves. It took a Savior to go to a cross. And the Messiah isn't enough unless he went to the cross. And if you were to look at the message and the misunderstandings from the disciples, that is the truth. He is the way, the truth, and the life. Did you know that the Greek, that word truth, we often misunderstand and we talk about, you got to believe exactly the way I believe. That isn't what he's talking about. That word true right there is really, not really, it's real. God is real. He is real. He is the way. He is the life. That's what he's trying to say. It's not fake. It's not made up. It's not some sort of dream, and it's not just a great story, even though Mark has done a great job. Jesus Christ is real, and he is here to save us and has been here to do it and has accomplished everything he needs to accomplish to get there. So that's the first thing, and hopefully that helps unpack it a little bit and helps us see, the fact is we got to see Jesus through the lens of his sacrifice. If we don't see the whole picture. The second one is childlike. We got to become childlike. We had that prediction, and they misunderstand, and then Jesus tells them, I want to see all the kids that want to come see me, and what do? They keep them away. And as you think about that, now I got to have my opinion at some level, and that's what interpretation is an opinion. But when we talk about what it means to be childlike, it does mean putting others before yourself. It means not making a mountain out of a molehill, but instead simplifying things. The truth is that, this is my experience anyway. Whenever I first became a Christian, we were headed out to Kansas. I was going to go to Kansas State University, to become an architectural engineer. And in the process, I started teaching this junior high Bible class. Boy, that was interesting. So, but in the midst of that, I'm a young adult at this point. I don't even remember how old we were, Becca. 21, 20? Oh, I was really young. Okay. I'm old now. I won't talk about how old I am. But so I was teaching this Bible class, and we were teaching the parables. I remember the exact book I was using, the whole thing. And I was 20 years old. I was talking to another 20-year-old, and we were having a conversation, and all of a sudden this little junior high girl shows up right here. And it doesn't matter where we walk, this little junior high girl is right there with us. And in my naivety or whatever it was, I looked at her, I said, what do you want? She's like, nothing, Eli. I just want to be near you. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, it just absolutely transformed the way I looked at everything that I was doing. I just thought I was helping somebody, teaching a class because they needed somebody. In fact, I was doing more than that. I was helping change their lives. And she just wanted to be in my presence. Now, that rocked my world enough that I went to ministry school. And so a couple other things, and that's a whole nother conversation. But here's the thing. Think about it. Those little kids, where do they gravitate to? They gravitate to the people that they want to be like, right? So if we're supposed to be childlike, we've got to gravitate to Jesus, right? You follow me? We've got to want to be there. And we can't make, what he's done for us through the gospel is he's taught us a worldview, a way to live, a way to see the world. And the only way we're going to get that clear and understand it and see it with the right lens is to be in the presence of Jesus Christ. That's the only way we're going to get there. And so for us to be childlike, that's what we got to do. And that, talk about, I'll just mention a couple things, and you guys can stew on this later, so because I don't have enough time to talk about everything. But one concept is forgiveness. Just how hard do we make that? I mean, be honest with yourself. How hard do you make that for yourself? It's actually a pretty simple process, but boy, do we make that hard. I'm trying to think. Here's another thing. If they're not for us, they're against us. As a body of believers, how hard do we make that when I think we're getting better here, but you go back 30, 40 years, we made this really, really hard. If someone doesn't believe exactly the way you believe, they're not doing things right, and I'm right and you're wrong. And instead, Jesus says, no, to some degree, it's not your problem. It's God's problem. Your job is to go do what God has called you to do, and they're going to go do what God has called them to do, and God will sort it all out in the end. See, that's much simpler than sometimes what we make it. In my opinion, that's what I think Jesus is pointing to. We got to put others before ourselves and get to the core of what we're trying to do. The last one, sacrificial service. And as you think about that, I've read all kinds of things about sacrifice. I know you have too. We've seen Jesus' sacrifice. We've seen the sacrifice of the Old Testament and what it means to really sacrifice. We hear about it when we talk about giving and other things in our faith, but don't often hear about sacrificial service. What does that really mean? What does that look like? And it's interesting. I told Dan there's no way my message is going to line up with his, but it does right here. What is sacrificial service? It's love. There's different words in the New Testament about what love is. There's Philadelphia, there's eros. Those are two different words, but the word agape means sacrificially giving of yourself to another person. Sounds like a great definition for me. What do you think? I mean, that's the thing. And as I begin to close here a little bit, I hope that if nothing else, that you remember this, that our job is to follow and to be in the presence of Jesus. Jesus will help us make those steps of belief and steps of faith where we need to when we're in his presence. We have got to see the forest, not just the trees. And Jesus came here. The disciples obviously misunderstood simply the very core of what Jesus was trying to do and what he was trying to teach. And if they're that close to him, there's no way that we can feel like we've always, or maybe ever in this lifetime, going to have it all figured out. But our job is to be in the presence and to learn each day as he presents opportunity for us to learn. The other side of that is I would say this, that in conflict is where you learn the most. And so don't ever be afraid to be in conflict. It's about dealing with it and learning from it and moving on.